Okay, so the virtually what led up to the Gallipoli campaign was the entry of the Ottoman Empire into the First World War. Australia and New Zealand were brand new countries. They were a part of the British Empire, and like all parts of the empire, they were fighting the war on the side of the British Empire. Now, the troops were originally designated for the Western Front. However, with the stalemate that had occurred for nearly over a year in 1914, they believed there was needed a new plan. One of the head people that made a plan was actually the future Prime Minister of Great Britain and the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Sir Winston Churchill. He was the head of the British Admiralty at the time and had made a plan with various other various groups of people to make the plan for the Gallipoli campaign. So Australian and New Zealand troops that formed the ANZAC Corps were eventually redesignated from for Europe to Turkey when the Ottoman Empire ended up joining the war on the side of the tripartite. It was believed that the Ottoman Empire would be weak and so internally wrecked that it wouldn't be able to stand up against a modern European army. Now, this was a wrong attitude, and it did cost the Entente. Australian troops were trained in Egypt. Some of the training was not adequate, and it has been reviewed in the recent times that Australian troops may have been not as good as has been made. The Australian army wasn't well tested. It had only been fought in it had fought in the Boer War in its individual colonies, so it hadn't been properly tested before. So, what ends up happening? I'll just get another marker. Just get up a map. Okay. Right, so when dealing with the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, as I said before, the Ottoman Empire was a very weak empire, as well as Austria. The Central Powers of Europe were very weak compared to the Allies, or to the Entente. Now, this is a map of the Ottoman Empire. This land around here is called Anatolia, or was formerly called Anatolia. This city, you will know it as Istanbul today. Used to be called Constantinople. Now, there are two seas that the former Ottoman Empire was near. Now, Turkey. This way, we'll just get a charge on that. Okay, so as we've stated, the Ottoman Empire was a very weak empire compared to the other empires in the First World War. There were two main seas that bordered the empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Now, a big part of the entry of, before the Ottomans entered the war, there were two factions in the Ottoman government. There was a pro-German faction and there was a pro-British faction. The German faction had more control. They were concerned. The British were very pro-Greek, as well. The Germans were anti-Russian, and the Ottomans had been at war with the Russians for centuries. Additionally, the British were very close to the Ottomans. The British Empire bordered the Ottomans, so the British caused more of a threat. Additionally, the Germans offered more favourable terms. They offered more equipment, guns, and financing. So, what actually set off the Ottomans in the First World War was a naval battle. It occurred on the 29th of October at 6:30, 1914, at the Battle of Odessa. The Ottomans refused. The Allies, the Entente, had requested that the Ottomans expel all German ships and naval vessels in Ottoman ports. The Turkish refused, and the Ottomans opened fire on Russian ships and sank Russian ships, causing an Ottoman defeat, or causing an Ottoman victory over the Russians. This officially started off the First World War for the Ottomans. Now, a big problem was, and if you know anything about Russian history, you'll know that the First World War did not end well for the Russians. This red line, I'll just see if you can still see that. Okay, crap. You may have not seen that. Alright. Pretty much this area here is the trade routes for the Russians, connecting it to the rest of Europe. The reason for that was the Baltic Sea was mined with everything. It was full of neutral countries as well, but it was as well the Baltic Sea is virtually where the German Navy was held. So virtually, this is the shipping paths for all. The Baltic Sea was where most of the German Navy was stationed. So it was very hard for the Russians to get by there as well. So the Black Sea was literally the main trade route for the Russians at this stage. But the only problem was the Ottomans were now blocking their trade route. So what ended up occurring was the Russians ended up begging the British to send an invasion force to break the Ottomans quickly, so then they could get trade, or they could get supplies through to the Russians. Now, the way the British thought they could do this area is called the Dardanelles. It's a small peninsula. They believed by knocking out the batteries on the coastline of the Dardanelles, they would then be able to send naval squadrons up to Constantinople and then take on Constantinople and eventually destroy the Ottoman Empire and then get trade through to the Russians. Now, a lot of this was built on bad old history and bad thinking at the time. The Ottoman Empire had been through a 200-year decline, literally since the 1700s. Napoleon had taken advantage of the Ottoman Empire, the British Cairo used to be, well, Egypt used to be an Ottoman puppet state, pretty much, or part of the Ottoman Empire. It used to nearly went out to Tunisia and all that, and Libya and stuff. Virtually, the Ottoman Empire had been declining. Greece used to be an Ottoman Empire possession. So because of the collapse of the European section of the Ottoman Empire, it had caused the Entente to believe that the Ottomans were just so weak. After the collapse of the European section of the Ottoman Empire and the Balkan Wars, there was the Italo-Ottoman War that saw the Italians literally wipe out the Ottoman Navy. There was there were continuous Russian and Ottoman wars. And now the Ottomans were now having to do tribal groups rising up in the Middle East or in the Arabian Peninsula. Now we'll get to that in a sec, but I will now talk about what ended up happening with what this has to do with Anzac Day. I will get out the list of the regiments that were formed. So there were a couple regiments that were sent to Gallipoli at the time, but I'll list them off because it wasn't just Australia. There was the 29th Division of the Royal Naval Division. There was the 42nd East Lancashire Division. There was the 52nd Lowlands Division, 10th Irish Division, 11th Northern Division, 13th Western Division of the British Army, the 1st Australian Division, 2nd Australian Division, New Zealand and Australian Division ANZAC troops, or ANZAC Corps, the 29th Indian Brigade and the Oriental Expeditionary Corps of the French Army and the 1st and 2nd Division of the French Army were all sent to Gallipoli. I'll talk about Australia a bit now. When the First World War broke out, most of the British Empire was and as well across the world, most people were enthusiastic and thought these wars would be over quite quickly. And as well, most major wars hadn't occurred for at least 50 years. Britain had not been in a major European war for a very long time. The Crimean War was not a major conflict. It was bloody, but it wasn't a major conflict, and Britain won it. But and virtually every war since then, Britain had won victoriously against colonial powers and had not gone to war with, I think, any European power. France was defeated by Germany in the war and German unification, but in reality had gained so much wealth and so much power through its colonial possessions and its military might in colonial wars. So you can understand why it was thought that this war would be over so quickly, because virtually every country that went into this war had won colonial wars or won a European war at some stage before the First World War. So I think the only country in this war right now that hadn't won anything and had been constantly losing was probably the Ottomans. So the Ottomans understood that they weren't going to... I'll continue with Australia, actually. So Australia prepared for war once the declaration of war was made by Britain in 1914. All imperial possessions of the British Crown were at war with the Central Powers. been Germany, Austro-Hungary, and eventually the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a bit of a surprise, but many famous Australians took part in this war as well. In Melbourne, there was a famous Australian that's actually on the $100 bill, Sir John Monash, and the University of Monash that's just up the road in Royal Parade in Parkville. That university is named after him. So John Monash, before the war, went to Scotch College, a very famous Melbourne school, and as well, I think it was a surveyor, helped build some of the very famous Melbourne bridges, and he was Jewish, German by descent. I think he was born in Melbourne. Monash came from low standings, but went up the ladder and created quite a career. He was also part of the colonial Victorian militia that was like the part-time military of Victoria at the time. So Monash, and when the First World War started, all part-time military officers were made officers in the Australian Imperial Force, or Australian Imperial Expeditionary Force, also known as the first AIF, that became part of the ANZAC Corps, or part of the ANZAC Army. There were other famous Australians that took part in this war. A family that you will probably remember is the Murdochs. So the Murdoch family. Keith Murdoch was a reporter and became a representative of the Prime Minister of Australia at the time for the Australian government in Europe and the military campaigns. Murdoch wrote of what was happening in the wars and became very famous. And as you know today, the Murdoch media empire has grown from those decisions ever since. Murdoch himself went to Camberwell Grammar, I believe, in Melbourne, so also a very famous school. And who else? What was it? There are a lot of famous Australians that took part in the war, but so we'll get down to what actually started to happen. We'll draw up the Dardanelles.